Well, hello, RC from the Mountaintop Joiner Shop here. It has been quite some time since I last posted a video on YouTube. I believe it was the end of January when I posted the final installment of my trestle table build series. And while in the intervening months I have had some commission inquiries, I haven't pursued them very aggressively because I've had some other things going on. One of those things is gardening. I'm almost as into gardening as I am into woodworking, if you can believe it. And I grow a considerable percentage of what my vegetarian wife eats during the summer, as well as my kid. And of course, I'm not immune to making some homemade salsa from the garden myself. And so the spring obviously is the time to get cracking and lay the groundwork for a good summer garden. So I've spent a lot of time on that, but also in a slightly woodworking adjacent turn of events, my family and I have purchased a small travel trailer with which we could cavort about in the countryside with our soon-to-be first grader in tow. It seems like a great way to spend time with the family, and it turns out it has been. And so we have all kinds of camping trips under our belt already, and a whole bunch more planned for later in this summer. What has since been dubbed the Vermilion Vamoose Caboose has been good fun, but also been quite a bit of work because there's lots of modifications that we've made to that trailer in order to make it better suited to our personal needs. And of course, that sometimes involves a little bit of woodworking. So one of those Vermilion Vamoose Caboose projects that I have worked on in recent months is a slide-out tray for our cooler. And I posted nothing of that on YouTube or any of my social media because I also took a break from social media in large part for the sake of my mental health and sanity. Now I am back though because I got the itch. And I have one more thing I'd like to build for the trailer that I can think of at the moment anyways. And I figure why not? Why not film it and kind of bring you guys along for the ride? So it will involve some solid wood hand tool woodworking. Let's do it. So I want to show you that slide out cooler tray that I was talking about and then give you an idea of what I have planned next. So here I am filming something outside the house for the first time ever for this channel. I don't have the correct filter for the lens on this camera, so it's awful bright. And also because I live in suburbia, and in suburbia there's always some effing guy making a bunch of noise. Sometimes that effing guy is me. There is some noise in the background, but hopefully you can hear me okay. So this is a 5x10 square drop trailer, travel trailer. And this back door here is quite large, but it leads to a set of shelves that basically creates a galley. So let me open this up so you can see what's going on. So normally we have a bunch of camp stuff in here, like camp chairs. We have all kinds of like silverware, pots and pans and plates and cups and stuff like that. Down in the bottom here, I have a power station. Normally this cooler here would be plugged into that. This is a powered cooler, so it works as a fridge or a freezer. And I wanted to store this in here in such a way that we could access it easily, but also not make a waste of the space that's behind this little wall here. So what I ended up doing is making a slide out tray that moves in two directions. So I just lift this little pin here, which keeps it from moving while we're driving around. And then I just slide it over until it hits a stop. The stop is on the back wall here, and it also helps hold that power station in place so it doesn't slide in that direction. Once it hits the stop, I can then slide it out this way with these locking drawer slides. Locks in place, and then I can open up the cooler and access all of my food. And normally we would have a table right here with a 2-burner stove on it with which to cook our food and an awning over our heads. What ends up happening is we don't have any place to do our food prep really that's close to this area other than the top of the cooler. And then of course when you need to get in the cooler, all your food's in the way. So what I want to do is put a little table that attaches to this shelf right here and extends outward. Another problem that we have is this big door. This door is lightweight and it's very large, and it tends to get caught in the wind in such a way that it can just take off on you and potentially damage the hinges. And we don't really like having it propped all the way open like this. What I'd really rather have it do is stick straight out. So let me move the camera over and show you what I have in mind to fix these problems. So what I have in mind here is a table that hooks on to the lip of this shelf right here. That's about yay wide, so I can still access this door and have it stick out this way. And so I'll have it come out all the way to where this handle is and hook onto the handle. If I make the table such that it hooks in behind here, it'll help hold this door in place and keep it from getting blown around by the wind and holding it exactly where we want. I'll have a leg sticking out the bottom of that table to the ground to help support the weight. Then when it's all said and done, I can take the leg off, collapse it, lift it off of this lip, and then stuff the whole thing onto a shelf. That is kind of a rough idea of what I'm trying to do here. I don't have a lot of time to do it if I want to use it for our next trip. We're leaving on Saturday for our first trip ever to Yellowstone, and it is Tuesday right now, Tuesday afternoon. If I don't get carried away and dovetail everything, I might be able to make this quickly enough to where we can use it for that trip, but we'll see. Let's go back into the shop and see if we can't make this happen. All right, so I dug around in my lumber rack, and the only thing I really have a lot of in my shop left over from other projects is cherry and soft maple. And the soft maple is the only thing I had in a long enough length to make a panel out of that would constitute the top of the table and the drawer box that's going to go underneath the tabletop. So I'm going to glue up this maple here into a panel that will kind of expand and contract with humidity changes at more or less the same rate. And then I'll put drawers underneath that will have cherry drawer fronts on them just to kind of make it pretty. The inside of that galley is all kind of like Baltic birch plywood. The maple matches somewhat similarly. I'm not too worried about that. In the end, I think it'll look fine. I'm not trying to make something that's like super fancy and beautiful for the house. This is just for a travel trailer. So I'm going to cut these to length. That table is about 105 centimeters long or so. So I'll make some panels that are about that long, and then we'll take it from there. So first things first, we'll take it over to the saw bench. Okay, so I got those panels all glued up and I cleaned off the glue with a carbide scraper and then I let them sit for a while, quite a while. In fact, my hope that I would get this project done before the Yellowstone trip turned out to be hilariously optimistic. It's been a couple of weeks now and that's now 2 trips ago. So it is what it is though. One of the panels that I did stayed perfectly flat in the meantime. The cherry board that I milled for the drawer fronts also stayed flat. This panel right here though, actually moved just a little bit. It's got just a little bit of a bow to it, and I think maybe just a tiny bit of a twist. Just a little bit. So what I'm going to do with this one is make it the drawer box that goes underneath the top. To my mind, it's almost a good thing that that stock is a little bit thinner stock. It's going to help lighten the overall weight of this whole contraption. So I'm going to go ahead and flatten this and run it through the thickness planer again, make it a little bit thinner, make it flatter of course, and then I'll zip off the ends at the track saw over here and start making this into the drawer box that's going to go underneath that top. In the meantime, I received a fun comment saying that my apron is so clean that I can't be trusted to be giving good woodworking advice. So I don't know if you can see it or not. It's actually quite filthy, but to be fair, I did run it through the wash once, like a year ago, and apparently that was a mistake. I think I've ruined my street cred by doing that. So I guess you may as well just kind of stop watching now since, you know, I don't know what I'm talking about in here because my apron's so clean. Moving on. Okay. So I did some thinking because I got to the point where I zipped off the ends nice and square on this panel that's going to make up the bottom or the drawer box that goes underneath the table that I'm building here. What I might ordinarily do is create a drawer box that has a top and sides and a bottom and then just glue that whole thing to the underside of a tabletop. But I don't really want to do that because that involves more wood and that will make the project heavier than I want it to be. So as much as I want this project to be simple and just get it done, the way I'm doing it to keep it light requires strong joinery principles that are necessarily more complicated than I might otherwise employ. So what I'm going to do is cut off the ends of this to make the sides. And I'm going to do a divider as well. And what I'm going to do, instead of putting a top on that, I'm going to dovetail those sides and the divider directly to the tabletop. And that will give it a nice strength for the drawer box to kind of hang from. And of course, I'll do some things on the back of the case as well that will add quite a bit of strength. And you'll see that as we go along. But what I'm going to end up doing is cutting some dovetail sockets to mount this whole thing to the underside of the top. And of course, those ends, the sides of the drawer box, I'm going to dovetail to the bottom as well, again, for the additional strength that that's going to allow me. So as much as I'm trying to avoid just dovetailing everything, I'm going to end up dovetailing everything. That's where we're at. So I'm going to cut these sides, cut a divider out, and we'll move on to the next obstacle. Okay, so I zipped off those parts, and this is what it's going to end up looking like. I try to do it so the grain is contiguous, and these ends will dovetail to the sides, and then the ends will also be let into the top. So this drawer box actually isn't going to be as tall as it looks here. There's also going to be a divider in the middle here somewhere. I don't know if I want to center it or offset it. I haven't really decided yet. I'm kind of leaning towards offsetting. I don't know, I just like the idea of that better. So I'll probably end up doing that. So I got to dovetail these sides on the end here and then put a single dovetail on the end of each of these sides here. I'm going to let into the top. So that's what we got coming. So first things first, I'm going to dovetail these sides to the bottom. Oh, one more thing I almost forgot to mention. I'm going to let in the back end of each side, or at least this side, to allow the back that's going to go on here to extend past the end of this drawer box, because that's going to be the part that fits in behind the door handle that I showed you in the intro to this video. So I'm going to let that out first, and that's going to tell me where my dovetails are going to terminate at the ends here. Okay, so let's do some basic dovetail layout. I let in the back end of this side, so now I know where my tailboard is terminating here. You know, there's a lot of different ways you can do the layout of dovetails, like a lot. And that's true of just about anything in woodworking. There's lots of ways you can do it, but this is a way that works well for me. What I like about it is its simplicity. All I'm going to be using here is a basic wheel gauge and a pair of dividers. So first things first, I want to mark the thickness of my pin board on my tailboard. So my tails are going to be at the bottom of the side here. So because this board is basically the same board with just a cut in it, I can just lay my wheel gauge right into the gap in between them. Press down nice and hard. Double check your setting to make sure it matches the thickness, and it does. Because this is my tailboard, I'm going to go ahead and put that mark all the way around both sides and edges of the board. And I like to make them fairly deep, not crazy deep, but pretty deep, especially in those ends. This is going to be the inside of this case, so I like to saw in from the show face, so this side I don't make as deep as this side typically, but I do want to be able to see it, and I want to be able to drop a chisel right into that knife line later on in the process. Then I'm going to go ahead and put this up in my leg vise and show you how I like to lay out the actual tails. Okay, so what I'm going to show you is just a super basic symmetrical tail layout. So got a pair of dividers here, and what I want to do is start with the tip of the dividers lined up with the end of the board, and I'm just going to walk it across and see where I end up. So that's 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 tails. If you look where I ended up here, I'm not really close enough to this edge. I'd like the space between the end of the tail and the corner of the board to be smaller than that, just for the sake of looks. Now, if I left it chunky like this, that would, in theory, be a little bit stronger, but as a dovetailed joint, it's going to be strong regardless. So I may as well make it look a little bit better. So what I'm going to do is open up the dividers just a tiny, tiny little bit and try again and see where I end up. So this is kind of the fiddling phase of setting your dividers to mark out your tails. And you can see I overdid it there. It's a very, very small adjustment can make quite a big difference because it's compounded over the number of tails that you're cutting. So let's see, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Oh, look at that. So that's maybe 5 or 6 mil from the end of the board. I like that. That's kind of the amount of space I prefer to have there. And this will also coincidentally be the space in between each of the tails along the board, is the distance from that corner to that part of the divider. So I'm going to go ahead and mark the end grain this time. So I'm going to start in the same spot right at the end, and then I'm going to press down a little bit and make marks in the end grain. Let's get a little bit deeper there. There we go. So I'm just kind of pressing and wiggling it in, working my way down the center of the board. And one more right at the end there. So I got little divots along the way. Now I'm going to do the same thing starting from this corner right here. So there's a divot there, and so on and so forth. All right, so my weapon of choice for a dovetail square are these Veritas ones, and this one is a 1:6 ratio. That one to me just seems like a perfect middle ground between the 14-degree one that I have and the 1:8 ratio that I have. It's just pronounced enough to me to be attractive. So your mileage may vary, but it's 1:6 for me for dang near everything. This is a little bit awkward to do because the camera's in the way, but what I'm doing is taking my mechanical pencil, which is a 0.5 mil lead, dropping it right into that divot and sliding my dovetail square over to it, and then drawing a line. So I'm cutting to a pencil line when I cut the tailboard, and then when I cut the pin board, it's going to be all knife lines, because that's going to be the one where it's very critical that you are cutting right to the line. And I already screwed up. So because I was talking instead of paying attention to what I was doing, I put this line in the wrong spot. What you want to do is start from the end, like that, then skip a divot and go to the next one over. So you're doing every other one. So I'm going to erase the mark I put on the front there and come back to that line later. So I have marked the end of this tail here. I'm going to skip a divot and come to the next one and do every other one all the way down the board. So there's a divot here. I'm going to skip that and go to this one. That, skip this one, go to this one. And I don't have to make super pronounced pencil lines because This is soft maple. All my pencil lines are going to be super easy to see. I can appreciate that because as anybody who has been afforded the opportunity to get older will know, your eyes start to fail you in some respect. So it's nice when you can see what you're doing. All right, so that's every other line on the way over. Now I'm going to go back to this one that I did before. This will be the other side of my tail, so I actually use the other side of the marker here. I'm going to have to crouch down for this part, I think. All right, so just like that, and mark that there. Repeat that process on every other divot all the way down the board. So that is a basic symmetrical dovetail layout using just a pair of dividers and a wheel gauge, and of course a dovetail square, which I forgot to mention earlier. So yeah, you actually need 3 things to do that, but that's it. I think once you've done it once or twice and kind of wrapped your head around it, it'll come pretty naturally to you. And then it's just a matter of paying attention and making sure that you put your lines in the right place. Otherwise, you're going to end up with some pretty funny looking dovetails. Okay, so I marked out the tails on the other board that I had to do in the exact same way that I just showed you. And because this board is slightly wider than this board, the dovetails on this board ended up being slightly wider than the dovetails on this board, but there's the same number of them. So I hope that kind of makes sense. So I'm going to set that aside, and now I have this board chucked up in my bench on bench. And if you're curious what this contraption is all about, I did an entire video on it way back in the day where I talk about how I came across the design and how I kind of adapted it to my personal needs. One of the things I did was put a big Moxon vise on it, which ends up being great for my dovetailing setup. So my weapons of choice for this are going to be a fret saw. This is a 6-inch fret saw from New Concepts. These things are awesome because you can change the angle of the blade relative to the frame in a way that's very consistent and even. So if you look at these nuts right here, that shows you what the orientation of the blade is. It's set at a 45-degree angle. So when I come in here to remove the waste from my dovetails, the frame never gets in the way if you have it set up like this and you're right-handed. Of course, you can do the same thing left-handed as well, 45-degree angle. So that's what I like to do to remove the waste in between my tails, or at least the bulk of it. And for the actual sawing, I use this guy. This is a custom dovetail saw from Bontz Sawworks. I don't think Ron Bontz is doing these anymore, which is a shame because they're absolute jewelry. These things are fantastic and they're not cheap either, but I cut all of my dovetails by hand and I use dovetails in the large majority of my projects. Basically anything that has casework or drawers in it or any kind of right angle panel, it's probably going to have dovetails in it, and I'm going to be cutting those by hand using one of these guys. And one of the ways in which this is a custom saw is it has a custom hang angle that matches the kind of high sawing style that I use here. The bench on bench takes the dovetails that I'm sawing and puts them kind of right up under my nose so I don't have to bend over as much and throw my back out. So I have it up in here. I'm going to show you how I like to saw these and maybe throw in a few pointers if you're just kind of learning this stuff that will help you kind of get up to speed a little bit more quickly. So for this project, I'm going to go ahead and live dangerously and just start sawing. But if you're new to cutting dovetails by hand like this with a back saw, then you'll probably want to take a board similar to the one that you're about to cut your dovetails in and just put a whole bunch of angled lines on them just like this with your dovetails squared. And of course, because you're not actually cutting tails, you can put a whole bunch of lines all right next to each other and you can practice sawing to those lines. But really the important thing when you're sawing the tail boards is that you're at a perfect 90-degree angle across the end grain on top here. If this angle ends up being a little bit off of that 1:6 ratio that you marked on the board, that is not the end of the world because you're just going to transfer that tail angle to your pin board later, and that's where it'll become critical that you saw that exact angle at that point, but not when you're actually cutting the tails. I hope that makes sense. And another thing you'll notice that I have done is I've only marked the end grain and the show face of my tail boards. I didn't actually draw that angled line down the back of my tail board. If you're new to this, you probably will want to do that though, because you're going to want to, as you're sawing each of these tails, to kind of peek over the back here and see if you're actually cutting the same angle on the back as you are on the front. If not, you're actually introducing some kind of weird torsion or twist to the saw plate that is causing your lines to end up a little bit wonky. Food for thought. maybe mark the back of there too and kind of check yourself before you wreck yourself. So I'm going to go ahead and start sawing these, and the way I like to do it is to saw the right side of each tail first and then do the left side all the way down the board. That way you get a little bit of a rhythm going, cutting the same angle as you move along the board. And it doesn't really matter if you start with the right side or the left side, but it is good to do the same side of every tail going one way and do the same side of every tail going the other. I think you'll be getting a little bit more consistent results by approaching this in a consistent manner like that. I'm going to go ahead and make sure my light is shining on what I'm doing, and I'm going to go ahead, put my thumbnail up to here and make sure I'm lined up with the edge here. Just like that. Now that I've cut right at the corner of that, I can make sure that I am cutting both to the line on the top and the line on the front more or less simultaneously. And to the best of my ability, I am trying to cut that pencil line right in half. Let me see if I can zoom in on this a little bit more so you can see what that looks like. All right, so I got you just about as close as I can get you without the camera getting in the way. And you can see that as I'm sawing here, I've already established the line on the end grain to make sure that it is square, because that kind of takes priority here. And now I'm trying to follow the line. Let me get in the curve here. Trying to follow the line down to the baseline. And this is one of the reasons I like to saw from the show face, so I can keep an eye on my curve and make sure I don't saw past the little baseline I marked here with the marking knife earlier on. Once I've hit that, I leave it alone. But one thing I like to do is kind of angle the saw even down a little bit and overcut the baseline on the back side. That simplifies the removal of the waste. So that's a technique I like to use. Nobody really cares if there's a little bit of a saw curve on the inside of a case like this. Cases in particular. If you're talking about the inside of a fancy drawer, maybe not cut over your baseline back there. Otherwise, go ahead and have at it. Overcut it a little bit, and when you remove your waste, you'll have less stuff getting in the way. All of the curves on the right side of each tail. Now I'm going to go ahead and move my light to the other end of my bench to illuminate this side of my saw plate so I can cut down the left side of each of these tails. One thing I want to show you is getting your curve started. So again, I like to use my thumbnail to kind of apply pressure to make sure I don't send my saw plate into the wrong direction. Once I get it lined up there, I'll draw back, but I'm not really applying very much pressure on the drawback, nor am I applying a lot of pressure when I actually start my forward stroke. So think of it as kind of taking a plane in for a landing. You don't want to just slam the thing down onto the tarmac. You want a nice gentle touching down. So just like that. If you really bear down with pressure, you tend to get a saw plate that wants to skip across the face of the board, or even kind of get jumpy and jump out of the curve and end up somewhere else on accident. So a nice light touch as you're touching down to get your saw cut started. Once you got your curve started, it's good to use as much of the saw plate as you can get away with without accidentally taking it out and bashing the front of your saw plate into the face of the board, which I have been known to do. I probably should have ordered a longer dovetail plate, but it is what it is. Now after I've finished all these cuts on the other side of these dovetails, I'm going to remove the waste with the fret saw. And one of the things I'm going to do after I've removed all this waste is check to see that I'm square. before I do my other tail bore, just to make sure that I'm sawing straight. Alright, so before I chop out the waste in between my tails, I'm going to take off the waste on the ends of the tails. And what I like to do for that is just take a chisel a little bit wider than the stock and take out a little sliver down to that marking gauge line right there. Maybe that's a little deep. Let me deepen that knife line a little bit. It's a little tap tap. And hopefully that removes the rest of that. There we go. So now I have a nice little knife line there that I can drop the blade of the saw into and saw down and remove that. And what I like to use for that is actually a Japanese saw. So this is a razor saw. This is the S295, and I believe this is called a Dozuki. I totally don't remember, but I do like using this for this particular operation because it has a very narrow kerf. It makes it less likely that I'm going to bite into this knife line here as I'm sawing downwards. So let's give it a shot. I'll make sure I don't cut into the side of my tail, so I'm trying to stay nice and level. There we go. And as often the case, there might be a tiny bit of material on the baseline here that I'm going to need to remove with the chisel later, but that gets me nice and close, and then I can kind of chisel out any schmutz that's in the bottom of that corner as well. Now the next step is to remove the waste in between the tails, and for that I like to choose a chisel that is just slightly less wide than the socket in between the tails, so I can get the bulk of the waste out in kind of one pass and then just do a little cleanup of the opposite corner with a second pass. Very rarely does the chisel match up perfectly to the baseline socket, and that's fine. But if this socket was much wider, I would probably choose a chisel that is maybe just slightly more than half the width of the baseline of that socket. That way I'm not trying to remove too much waste with too wide of a chisel, because that can often push on the bevel of the chisel as you're removing too much waste and cause your baselines to get pushed back on the board, and then you end up with gappy baselines in your dovetails. So, and one of the first things I did when I grabbed this chisel is go over to my sharpening bench and touch up the end of that blade. I'm trying to get into the habit of doing that. So the two times that I want to sharpen are when I first pick up that tool for a particular operation in a given project, and of course when that blade appears to have gotten dull. The habit I'm trying to get into. All right, so now we're zoomed in tight, and hopefully you can see that okay. I don't know if my camera wants to focus, but what I'm going to try to do here is remove maybe half of this, the thickness of this waste in one pass, and then drop the chisel right into the baseline that I marked with my wheel gauge earlier on for the second pass. That way I'm not removing so much material again that I'm pushing the chisel back into my baselines. And that's usually how it works out when I remove the bulk of the waste with my fret saw. So I'm a tapper. You know, you can pair all these, but then you're leaning over your bench and it's not so great for your back. So I like to just sit down in a stool and just tap the waste away. And I'm only tapping until I'm about halfway through the thickness, or maybe a little bit further than that, of the workpiece. And I'll flip it over and come in from the other side, and that way I don't run the risk of blowing all the way through, messing up the baseline on the far side of the workpiece, and of course jabbing my sharp chisel into my workbench top. It's a workbench, and some people have different attitudes about it. You know, with their workbench, if it gets all dinged up, to them that's just how it is, you know. To my mind, it's how it is, but I still avoid doing it when I can, because I don't want to have to go through all of the work it's going to take to resurface my bench top when it gets too gnarly and starts to mark up my work pieces. So I try to keep my workbench for as long as possible nice and smooth. Let me go ahead and take out that far corner. And that's about half of the waste removed. Now I'm going to go ahead and drop it right into the knife line, which you probably can't see. Now I'm in the knife line all the way into this near corner of the socket. And I'm going to go ahead go a little bit more than halfway through. You probably can't see this, but I'm actually leaning the chisel in a little bit to try and undercut the baseline of the socket. So if in the inside of this socket I've undercut the joint, to me that is great because it's much less likely then that I'm gonna have to do any cleanup to remove any high spots in the bottom of these sockets later. Now I just got that wee bit in the far corner. I'm gonna check that I'm tucked right into that corner and do the same thing. Now this side of this socket is nice and cleaned up. All that waste will pop right out of there when I flip over the board and cut in just the exact same way from the other side of the board. So I'm just gonna go ahead and finish the rest of these, and then I'll have a tail board that is just about ready, once I kind of clean up the ends like I talked about earlier, to transfer those tail marks to the pin boards. Now that I have all the waste removed in between all my tails, I've taken this tail board and put it into my leg vise so I can check a couple things. So if you're new to this and you want to make sure that your sawing is worked out okay, or if you're just wanting to make extra special sure that your dovetails are as good as you can make them, you'll want to check them. And what I like to check them with is this guy. So this is a double square from Sterling Toolworks, and it has a special dovetailing blade in it. And that thin blade fits very nicely in between even the tightest of tails. And you can kind of check the sides of your tails to make sure that they're square to the face of the board, because that's pretty key in this case. And you can also slide it down into the baseline to check that you don't have any high spots in any of these sockets, to make sure that they're sufficiently undercut. If there's any humps in there, that's going to cause your joint to go together a little bit wonky. So maybe take a look at those things and make sure there's nothing awry. And then the other thing I'm doing while I have this in my leg vise is, you'll recall from earlier when I removed the side of this tail here, the waste on the end of the tail board, that the blade ends up just a little bit off of the baseline sometimes. And I can actually see the baseline right here where my knife cut. I can drop my chisel right into that and then wiggle my way in. Like that. And now I am right down to my baseline. And again, just like any of these other tail sockets, I'm perfectly comfortable undercutting the inside of this end here. So everything around the rim of this is now a little bit lower than the rest of it. And I'm going to remove the schmutz that's kind of down in that corner. If I have to, I'll come back this way and kind of work at it until everything is out of that little corner. Because you'd be surprised how much just having a little bit of dovetail waste stuck down in one of these little corners can kind of screw up the fit of the joint. So make sure it's nice and clean, everything's nice and square, all your sockets are undercut, and you should be ready to move on to the next step. Now we're to the all-important step of transferring the lines from our tail boards to the pin boards. There's numerous ways of going about doing this. One that I sometimes employ with smaller things like drawers is to put a piece of blue painter's tape right up to the knife line on the inside of the joint, and then use that to kind of register against when I'm aligning my tail boards to my pin boards. In this particular case, I think I'm just going to try just being careful, taking my time lining it up. So this is the panel that's going to end up with the pins on it, and I have another piece of wood that is cut off from the same panel, so I know it's the exact same thickness. And I'm going to put that right at the edge of my bench, right about there. The inside of this joint is going to face the bench. So here is my tail board lined up. You can see there's a carpenter's triangle right here in pencil. Maybe that's not dark enough for you to see, but there is one there. So this is how I know that this one lines up to this board in this direction. So I'm going to go ahead and drop this in here. So the inside of the joint is facing the bench. I'm going to try to get this just about even with this board. That. Now I'll move it back a little bit. Now there's the inside of my tail board. I'm going to just rest it on there like that and line it up. So I want the ends of my tails flush to the outside face of this joint, and I want these inside corners to be right up next to each other. Now here's a case where the board has a little bit of a cup to it. So you can see that I'm not flush here. I'm flush here at the ends, but it's high all through here. So this board has a little bit of a cup to it. So what I need to do is clamp that cup out of it. So I'm going to go find myself a little wedge and fix this. All right, so I went and grabbed myself one of these little door shims, and I'm going to cram that underneath the edge of the board, like so. And that should flatten this out a little bit. Yeah, see? That worked pretty good. Maybe just a smidgen more. I'll just push it in a little bit more like that. There we go. Take my time, make sure this is good and lined up. And then I'm going to come in here with my marking knife and mark out the tails onto the end grain of the pin boards. And I'm using this check edge marking knife. These are great for this. It has a very long, very skinny blade that can really fit in between tight tails very easily. So I'm pressing down with my offhand to kind of help hold it in place. I got it nice and lined up. This is probably the best I'm going to get out of this. So I'm going to go ahead and mark the end grain now. And I like to mark that nice and deep. So I'll make multiple passes. I really want to be able to see these lines clearly after I've removed this pin board. And of course I need to make sure I'm paying attention enough not to miss marking one of these. And of course this marking gauge has a little bit of a bevel on one side of it, so I have to keep flipping it back and forth to make sure that I'm cutting right up against the side of each tail. Last one. Now it's pretty easy to see these, and I can make it even easier by dropping the tip of a 0.5 mechanical pencil lead in there, 0.5 millimeter. Now it's super easy to see. And what I'm going to be doing after this is coming in here with a regular square, not this double square, but a regular square, and extending these lines down to my baseline, which I have yet to mark, but I left my wheel gauge on the same setting I used for the tail boards. Because this board was cut from this board, they're the exact same thickness. So I can go ahead and mark my baselines. I don't need a marker on the ends because I'm not removing any waste on these corners, just the face on both sides. So I've finished marking and tracing the tails to my pin boards. I have my knife lines marking the baseline, so I just need to transfer these markings from the end grain to the face grain with a standard engineer square and my marking knife. So before, when I did the tail boards, I just marked it with my mechanical pencil because the accuracy there isn't as critical as it is on the tail boards. So I'm going to go ahead and set my marking knife right into the knife line that's on the end grain and slide my square up to it and mark my knife line. Now some people will flip the square each way so that the bevel of the marking knife is facing into the waist. That's a level of OCD that not even I will stoop to. So this is such a skinny knife line that the bevel of the knife line is really not going to make any difference to the overall appearance of this joint once it's together. And besides the fact that this isn't a fancy furniture piece, it's going to be a commission that's going in somebody's house. This is going to be part of a travel trailer, and it's not super critical that they look perfect. The main reason I'm using dovetails on this project is that they're strong, not necessarily for their looks or to show off or whatever. I just want this contraption that I'm building to not fall apart ever. I'm going to go ahead and trace them in as well so they're easy to see while I'm sawing. And we'll go ahead and saw to those lines using the exact same sawing techniques that I used for the tail boards. Now this one I'm going to have to flip just so that I have more of the stock of the square on the end grain, so I know that I'm actually marking this line square. All right, so trace these in. And another note to those of you that are relatively new to dovetailing and looking for tips, one thing that's going to be very important early on until you really wrap your head around these things is to mark your waist. And I'll show you an example of that in a moment. It's a good idea to mark your waist if you're new to cutting dovetails, because if you cut on the wrong side of any of these lines, you're going to end up with a gap that's basically equal to the width of the saw curve. And of course you don't want that, so what you would do is just put X's, or really whatever works for you, on the end grain and on the face grain of every tail, or I guess it would be in this case a pin socket. Myself, I've cut so many dovetails in my lifetime, all hand cut, that I just see it. I just see where the gaps or the sockets need to be, and I just saw on the right side of the line just from having done it so much. And you'll probably get to that point yourself. But in the meantime, to avoid ever making that mistake, you'll want to mark your waist just like that. So while I was sawing these, I thought of something. So you'll recall earlier that when I was cutting these tailboards, I was stressing that it's important to cut square to the face of the board here. With the tailboard, it is the opposite. It's very important that you cut square to the end grain here. So when you're focusing on your sawing, maybe prioritize that a little bit. Ultimately, you want to saw as close as you can to the line on both the end grain and the face grain. But those are kind of your priorities if you want the joint to go together a little bit easier. Couple notes about removing waste with a fret saw. This little blade is a skip tooth blade and it does a great job until the stock thickness gets very thick. At that point you need to employ a little bit of body English in order to kind of get through this material a little more quickly. Otherwise you'll be sawing here for an awful long time. Because the blade is so small, I can fit it down into the curve just shy of bottoming out. It'll rotate pretty quickly to parallel with the baseline. So I get as close to the baseline as I dare, and then you'll notice that I'm rotating the saw kind of on this transverse plane, so I'm not cutting the full thickness of the stock at any given time until I get to the end of the cut. And after a while, you get really good at rotating this without changing the direction of cut. And of course, as I get to the end, I need to match the angle of the curve at the end of that tail. And there we go. Oh, and another thing I just thought of. I keep thinking of things. So I very, very rarely break a fret saw blade while cutting wood. And the reason for that is I don't tension the crap out of the blade. Some people tension the blade so tight that when you pluck it, it sounds a very high clarion note. That is so much tension that if you get a little bit wonky during your sawing, you're liable to break a blade, and that sucks. I don't want to break blades. I don't want to accidentally have a piece of blade go into my eye or something like that. I don't want to have to, go and replace this. That's a little bit of a pain in the tuchus, and of course you can run the risk of running out of blades and having to go buy more. So what I do is tension it until it almost plucks a note. I don't know if you can hear that or not. It's under tension, but you'll notice that when I'm sawing in the previous segment when I was talking about rotating the blade as you work through the cut, you'll see the blade actually bending under tension. In fact, I can kind of get it to do that just a little bit with my thumb right there. It has no bearing whatsoever on how accurately I'm able to cut with a fret saw. This isn't really a precision sawing instrument anyways in this particular scenario. Now, if I was using this with a driller's blade in it, yeah, maybe more so. But this waste is all going to get removed, or at least the rest of it is going to get removed with a chisel later. That's when it's going to be critical that I'm accurate, not when I'm using this fret saw blade. So I dial back the tension just a touch. And even though it's a little bit bendy as I move through the cut, I'm still able to get as close to the baseline as I dare to. Now I'm removing the waste on my pin boards, and because this is a much wider socket, of course I need to choose a different width chisel. So the one that I chose here, I think it's about a 1/2 inch chisel. Basically the point is that it is maybe just shy of half the width of this socket, or maybe more than a third. I could, if I wanted to, use an inch-wide chisel to remove this waste and get almost all of it in one fell swoop. But the issue with that is when you're removing that much waste all at once, you really have to pound the heck out of your chisels. And whenever you have to apply that much force on the hand tools while doing kind of precision joinery like this, you're more liable to run into mistakes. And in this case, I would be probably pushing back my knife lines a little bit. I'm gonna steer clear of that and just kind of use a little bit lighter touch with a little bit narrower chisel. Okay, so this video has gotten a little long, and I think this is a good stopping point because I finished cutting the through dovetails. And so we'll cut it off here. I'll try not to make videos longer than an hour or so because I know what the state of people's attention spans is these days. In the next video though, I'm going to be covering a little bit different kind of dovetail than you normally see in videos like this, where I dovetail the dividers and the sides of the case to the underside of the top. That'll be kind of half-blind dovetail adjacent, we'll say. So you'll get to see that and of course see how this project turned out in the end. It's quite the contraption, but I have been using it and it does work really well and look really good. So I appreciate you playing along with me while I shake off the rust. I hope you appreciate the deep dive into dovetailing that this video has turned into, and we'll see you in the next one. Now, if you like what you saw here, please hit like and subscribe. It would help me out a lot. Also hit the little bell icon if you want to be notified anytime I release a new video. And if you didn't like what you saw here, keep it to yourself, pal. Or watch one of my other videos. You might like one of those. Thank you for watching.